So tools of collaboration can be open source, can be closed source. But we also have a slight change in the way that we're working. So we're moving from large top-down groups towards more self-organized and smaller groups where somebody just takes, instead of being the leader role, actually takes a sort of steward role and is a volunteer to bring these groups together. This goes at the same time as making the tool's choice. And the size of groups really matters a lot. I wrote a blog article which is on the Open Co-op blog a few months ago called Making Groups Work. And in that, I suggested that actually there's a lot of information around the lucky number 7. People seem to suggest that actually having roughly around 7 people in a group is probably the perfect size to enable mass collaboration, because as you open up more people in each group, you end up with more lines of communication, more people to talk to. And when you get up to 14 people in a group over here, you've got 91 different lines of communication, which actually makes things a little bit less effective. So small groups are great, but probably not with more than about 7 or 8 people. And ultimately where we want to get to is that all these small groups are actually networked together via intergroup linkages. So if we were all to be able to use the same tools rather than all having disparate different tools, then we might be able to utilize intergroup linkages via tags. For example, if I was chatting in a group here about Open Co-op and I used the tag organic, it would be really nice if somebody else who was in a different working group, who was working on a similar platform, could, if they wanted to look at that tag, then they could just search that tag and see if anybody in any of the groups on this platform had been talking about that. It's kind of the way that Twitter works, but not perfectly. And if people were coordinated using similar technologies on a similar platform, or at least interoperable platforms where you could make a user tag, then we would be able to create deeper linkages between groups. We're also keen to see the replication of tools, so using the same bunch of tools again and again rather than needing to learn new tools all the time seems to be increasingly important for collaboration to happen. And the federation of those groups, so as alluded to earlier, if all these groups were linked, then we might be better at being able to improve our collaboration and coordination. So in my blog about making groups work, I actually suggested that there are various different types of groups and tried to split these up via status. Now, Laura came back with some very interesting feedback on this, and so I'm not really claiming that this is a definitive set of a list of all the different types of groups. I'm just suggesting that it may be a useful framework for the way that groups develop and evolve. So to start with, when you meet somebody and you have an interesting conversation, maybe at the pub, you know, quite often out of that, you will set up a chat group. 3 people, 4 people or more come together and say, okay, yeah, let's talk about this thing. And then you have talk, which carries on just like in any other chat group. Then flowing on from there, quite often, if those people decide they want to work together, they need more tools than something like WhatsApp can deliver to them. And then if that group evolves and actually does some work and becomes the point where it might like to do some business, then to my mind, it kind of graduates to a trading group. These groups all have different requirements. So for a chat group, all you really need are messaging tools. You need to be able to message the whole group or do one-to-one and hopefully share images and the all-important emojis. Then what I suggest is that working groups basically need all of that functionality, but plus they need some shared documents in order to be able to collaborate on actual work. They need calendars to coordinate themselves and probably some project management software in order to know who's doing what, when and why. And then finally, if you want to start trading in a group, you need all these original tools, but you also need some sort of customer relationship management system if you're going to be selling stuff. You need the ability to trade, so that could be mutual credit. You need some accounting software and some budgeting software too. So this is just one way of potentially breaking down the different statuses of groups. Another way of looking at this is what Rich and Natty refer to as their holy trinity. So Rich and Natty from the Harman and Spiral, great friends of the Open Co-op and have presented here before. And the way they break this down in their patterns for decentralized groups is they suggest that there are these 3 different types of tools that you might need. One being a tool for real-time communication, like we're doing here via video. Another tool for asynchronous comms, so conversations which happen not time-based. And then finally, a tool for static content, like a wiki or some sort of other document management app. This is another framework that we could use to describe the types of tools that we might need. So at the Open Co-op, as mentioned, for usability reasons right up until now, we have been using Zoom for real-time communication, email for our asynchronous comms, and Google Docs for static content. But we're very keen to get off to those and to use the open source tools that we own. And that's what we're doing here with Meet.coop. So hopefully that's going to evolve as we go forwards. And what we really want to do is enable more working groups, as I mentioned, via a shared platform which everybody owns. But recognizing that everyone's needs are not the same as everybody else's, this session is really about gathering input on the user needs and the use cases for various different types of groups in order that we can try and define some choices to move forwards. And at that point, I shall hand you over to Mike, who is going to introduce the rest of the session.
Okay, where I'm heading for with this introduction is to get us into breakouts, and I would like us to go into what I'm calling sectors of new economy practice. So that's a map of 7 sectors plus another one if you're not quite sure which one you want to go in. So that's where I'm heading for, but it's on a mapping space. You can see it's got the state over here, it's got the market over here, it's got households down here, it's got what I'm calling the mutual sector over there. This yellow blob is what people call by all sorts of names that we're debating here in this conference. We could call it the social economy, that's one of its names. And then in the middle is commoning. Yeah, and there's a politics about this whole space, you know, state, market, household, mutual sector, new social economy, commons. You know, so it's an economic and political space. I've taken this map from economist Robin Murray, who's 10 years ago was grappling with this issue of what was then being called a new social economy in the context of the financial crash and the environmental crisis. And he came up with this mapping of 4 economies and their relationship with the new social economy. So he talked about the state economy, which clearly isn't working. He talked about the market, you know, the market economy, which clearly isn't working for dealing with these issues. Interestingly, because he was concerned with technology and post-Fordism, he found he needed to put the household economy on there, because one of the moves that post-Fordist capitalism has made is to shift all sorts of economic activity to the household and to make it into self-service. So, you know, the things that we can do as individual households are radically transformed now. And then Robin talked about this other sector, which he didn't name it very well, I don't think. I find myself calling it the mutual sector. It's basically very much like what people mean when they talk about global civil society. And it's the sort of thing that's already been spoken about today. And somehow the new social economy, as Robin was talking about it then, is in the middle there. It interacts with all of these things. It interacts with all of those. So if we view this map now as about provisioning, you know, provisioning the basic material needs of society, which we could say that's what economy is about. All of these sectors are, all of these kinds of relationship are all involved in it. It's got these 2 dimensions. There's public and private, and then there's generic and particular down there. So the mutual sector is public, but it's about particular needs. You know, the state or similar levels of organization is public, but it's about generic needs. We may not like the state, we may not like the capitalist state, but something on that scale is necessary if we're to deal with the things that we need to deal with. You know, if we're to deal with global environmental issues, if we're to deal with interregional relationships. So, you know, something is going to have to live there. But it's not as we know it, Scotty. It's helpful, I think, to view this diagram as a diagram of a dance, which goes on around provisioning, which involves going in and out and in and out and in and out, all of those different kinds of modes of organization. And that's not easy to do. And I think it's not only a dance, it's a struggle as well. Yeah, this is a map of a struggle, because the relationships that there are here in the new social economy or in the commons economy or whatever we want to call it are not the same as the relationships out here in the margin. You know, it's not capitalist market. It's not liberal democratic state. It's not consumerist household. Yeah. So this is a map of struggle as well as some kind of downs. In the middle of this new social economy, it seems to me, well, certainly my choice is I want to put commoning there because it's the most extreme position in a sense. It's the most distanced from the market that we know. It's the most distanced from the state that we know. It's the most distant from the consumerist household that we know. So it seems to me in some way the commons or commoning is at the center. Yeah, and that's why David Bollier and Silke Helfrich talk about the resurgent power of the commons. You know, this really is a very politicized thing. It's why Stacco Troncoso says that the commons is the glue. I do believe it is, and that's why it occupies this position in this map. Just to pick up something that was voiced very early on, one of the things down here, if we're looking at public and particular down here, there's a great problem posed for us there about the plurality of particular needs. You know, very early on in this conference today, people were talking about we can't universalize everything. We can't have the same answers to everything. There are no standards that are going to sort everything out. And one of the big puzzles that's down here in the mutual sector now is how we deal with that genuine plurality and at the same time get the generic kinds of responses that are represented by this space up here. So the word vernacular was used earlier on, which is one of a good term to bear in mind here. This problem of how we get vernacular but still deal at a systemic level. Commoning, the politics of commoning, the economics of commoning, the practice of commoning is intrinsically a mutual sector practice. Yeah, it's not basically a state type practice. It's not basically a market type practice. It's not basically an individualist, consumerist kind of practice. So, in a sense, the future lies with what the mutual sector can do. Okay, here's a map of some breakouts. Please don't think that I'm trying to summarize the whole of the new economy in 7 categories. This is a way of flattening out an enormously complex reality. The first one here I've called solidarity economy. It's about resistance. It's about fighting austerity. It's about dealing with the habitat which may be being damaged and taken away from us. It's about land rights. It's about the right to the city. Number 2, I've called it care commons. So it's about social care, elderly care, caring for vulnerable and dependent people. The third one, we're now moving more into the market area. Breakout 3 is about producer co-ops, which has a huge range of variability within it. But the focus in that group will be about, here we are, we're trying to make livelihood as a co-op. How do we do that? And what kinds of tools do we need if we're actually a trading co-op and we have to put, we have to pay the rent through what we do. 4 is a different focus. It might be more close to consumer co-ops. It's about supply. It might be about regional food supply. It might be about fair trade. It might be about supplies for COVID-19. It's how do we get the stuff to the place where we are in order that we can provision people with what they need. Number 5 is about means of exchange. We're in the market sector. There is this whole fundamental issue about what are the means of exchange. So if our activity is to do with means of exchange, then maybe breakout 5 is where we go with that. Breakout 6 I've called cultural commons, and this is enormously diverse. It's basically about people's knowledge and capability. If our activity is about producing knowledges, about R&D, about producing colleges, about doing training for people, about bringing news to people, about telling the history to people, about enabling people to organise, I would say that was work in the cultural commons. Breakout 7 is digital infrastructure. And I'm kind of making a point by putting that, by letting that come last, because, digital infrastructure isn't the pivot of everything. At the same time, if we don't do digital infrastructure, then we may be compromised in all of these other areas. What I'm going to do now is to bring up a framework about tools, because we are, after all, trying to talk about the selection of tools. And the point that I want to make is that we're all a bit geeky, I think. We wouldn't be at this meeting if we weren't geeks of some kind. And it's so easy for us to dive into saying, have you tried this tool? Have you tried that one? Isn't this cool? We've been doing it this last week in the organising group. We've been coming up with new tools left, right and centre. And the reason I started with the practice, the organising, is because the tools have to serve the practice. You know, we just can't afford to fetishize the tools so much. But anyway, a tools framework, and this resonates with Ollie's in an interesting way. It's a framework with three phases to it. First of all, there's the Trinity, which, as Ollie referred to, that's the Trinity from Rich and Natty. Then there's the stack, which is a term that comes from guerrilla translations, the disco people. And basically, the Trinity is part of the stack, but it has a primary importance, which is why it's got a separate name, if you like. So there are three elements in the Trinity. Surprise, surprise. There are five in the stack. And then it seems to me necessary also to identify things that I've called specials, which are not part of the stack. They're not sufficiently generic. This is where we find we're doing something very particular. We need a particular tool. It needs particular skills. It's not dealt with in a generic way, but there may still be generic approaches to that kind of infrastructure. Something I want to say while I'm on this slide is that there's a gradient here, goes from left to right. The Trinity has tools for chats, tools for handling threads, tools for handling documentation. So examples of chat tools are Slack, Telegram, WhatsApp. Examples of threaded tools are forum software, Lumio, Discourse, good old-fashioned email. There's one called Julep, which I learned about this week, which sounds really quite interesting. And documentation tools, people use GDocs, there are wikis, you can use Etherpad. As you move to the right, there's a label that they're more curated. Yeah? Over on the left here, things are ad hoc. Nobody really goes back and refers to things. You know, there is no work that's required to organize this stuff over time. And as you move over to the right, you have to put in more and more effort to organize what you've written, what you put in the medium. And so, you know, there's a whole lot more labor in developing a wiki, for instance, than there is in having a Telegram chat. And being able to work backwards and forwards over that whole range is really important. The documentation dimension here is really important because if we're trying to deal with systemic issues, you can't do that in a threaded medium. You have to basically build a structure of documentation or information of this kind if you're trying to deal with systematic issues. You can't do it in chat, and you can't do it in threaded media either. So there is some quite interesting and dance that we need to be able to do between these three elements of the Trinity. Yeah, we need all of them, and the ways in which they work are different, and we need to be able to dance backwards and forwards across this whole range. And I just want to stress this thing about curating. In the last 2 months, as I've been kind of creeping up on this conference and working more with more people, I'm aware of just that there is a big difference between the people who've got to curate all the time, otherwise their world falls to pieces, and the people who just want to dive in and thrash it out in one great big long stream. And I think, you know, that's partly personality. I don't know what else it is as well. This work of curating is something that not everybody likes to do, but I think we're in a mess if nobody's doing it. Moving on from the Trinity stack, 5 more tools. Guerrilla Translations, whose notion this is, the stack is their notion. They call these convivial tools. And what they're referring to is Ivan Illich and his notion of tools for conviviality, which I think is a way of thinking about things that warrants a lot of attention now. You know, it was first voiced 50 years ago, but there is a lot that we still don't do. The stack is much more now about getting down to working together. It's about coordination. It's about making things happen. It's about working as a team rather than just kicking ideas around. So task handling is one of the stack applications. People might use Trello, they might use Rocket, there are various kinds of Kanban systems. And if you're seriously doing things, you've got to handle tasks some way or other. You've got to know who's doing which task, whether it's done yet, what stage it's at. So Calendars and address books, it's kind of obvious, but we can't manage without them. If you're collaborating together in certain ways, then you're going to need to record work hours. And so some of the tools in the stack are about recording work hours, which is not only about getting paid, it's also about fairness and about knowing who's doing what. And it's about being able to look at your own balance of labour as well. Collaborative writing, not everybody is in the writing business like Guerrilla Translations, but I think every medium to long-term organisation has to collaboratively write something at some time. So the capacity to collaboratively write is part of the stack. Shared cloud storage, it has become much more important to me in recent weeks. On the free platforms, it's relatively rare to find shared cloud storage as part of what's there on the platform. So you open an Etherpad and that's cool, but then, oh, what the fuck was that Etherpad that we did yesterday? And kind of, were there half a dozen? Where have they gone? Do they relate to each other? So collectively filing things is utterly important if we're in this for the long haul, and the free tool platforms really don't seem to necessarily do that. I would also say as well, while we're on this idea of the stack, if you look in the Guerrilla Translations Handbook, which is mentioned here at the bottom, as well as talking about the tools, they talk about their workflow, and that's really worth reading. They've thought very carefully about their workflow as a collective, and your workflow or my workflow might not be the same as theirs, but I think the attention that they've given to workflow is something that every movement organization needs to be able to deal with. The specials I'm not going to say much about. In different areas of work, depending on what kind of thing you're working on, you require different special tools. Contribution accounting is very important to the guys in the DISCO model of governance, for instance. Who contributes what? They've got a very sophisticated idea of contributions, and they need to be able to track it. I would put that alongside supply chain tracking as well. Databases, asset registers, handling digital media is a very specialized kind of area, needs special tools. Participatory budgeting, not everybody has to do that, but when you do, you really need the tools for it. Financial transactions, ledgers, again, it's not something everybody has to do every day, but if that's where you're working, you need tools for that.
Great, thank you, Mike. If you had a suite of tools like you've just described and a group of projects which are all happening on that, like in our group, we talked a little bit about incentivizing the development work on that platform using mutual credit. If you imagine that people who are within that kind of membrane that have come in and joined this collaborative project and are using the tools, you can imagine allocating them a certain amount of mutual credit or some other kind of token, which they could then use to go and allocate to any specific project that they wanted in order to provide a kind of token economics economy, which would itself would become a driver for adoption and utilization of the platform to support the projects. So to my mind, like forming this swarm, bringing everybody together in some way is like a key stepping stone towards so many other things that we hope to establish in the cooperative economy.
There is a really difficult dance. I think this idea of dancing is just so much in my awareness these days. I really want to respond to Laura's important point because I'm starting where Laura is. It's not about tools. It's not about technology. It's about organizing. It's about people being in working relationships. Yeah. But at the same time, we need to build infrastructure. If we don't build infrastructure, then we're just consumers or we're just in the market, and we're subject, maybe everything just runs by memes. And, maybe I'm a bit, maybe I'm that kind of personality. I don't trust memes. I don't trust swarms. Yeah. I think that I'm a designer. I like to see things being systematically approached and systematic provision of infrastructure if we possibly can. And it's not just going to evolve. We have to sit down and do designs, and at one level or another, it involves some kind of planning, some kind of designing. It can't just happen through conversation and swarming, and it's an incredibly difficult balance to get.
I totally agree, Mike. And I'm Leon, by the way. I'm trying to create local app stores. A local app store using some decentralized technology and stores of value and looking at all sorts of things. But I'll just quickly give a metaphor for what me and a network colleague who's helping us build all this, is film producer. Just a metaphor on. I saw something on Twitter about Rage Against the Machine, and it was when they banned one of their songs on the radio. So they went on live radio and did the song, but just basically said "fuck off." The whole lyrics of the song was, "You can't ban us, fuck off," basically. And it was quite interesting. So I tried to find it but I only came across something from 2 years ago on Radio 5 Live with Rage Against the Machine. And they said it was when they were going for the Christmas #1, and there was this big, massive campaign. And it was really interesting because the lead singer, John LaRoche, whatever, he dodged the question which was most pertinent, which was, you're owned by Sony, which is Simon Cowell's record label. So even if you win, he still wins. And they sort of dodged the real question. And if you think about that, when these people who created this movement to fight back against Facebook, because at the start of the conversation, he was saying, John LaRoche was saying, the UK and the US are coming together because they want to fight back again. It was very similar. It felt like the start of the conversation was now, in reference to Black Lives Matter. So he's gone on to that to talk about the economy. But what did they achieve? What did that movement of getting them to #1 achieve? If all of the people are finding out about this on Facebook, on advertising-driven revenue models, if all of the transactions were happening using Visa and MasterCard, if all of the wealth created was going to Sony and oh, we're going to donate some of the profits to shelter, is what they said, some of the profit. How is that a revolution? So me and my friend said, with the App Store and stuff we're trying to do, we want to get 20 million quid, buy all of the rights to the song, and then put it on a platform that's decentralized and whatever, and try and keep Rage Against the Machine song #1 for 2 years, and every pound of revenue that goes to that song gets distributed into who knows what, but it won't be going to the band because they're rich enough. It won't be going to a record label because we own it as people, and we're going to send it to organizations and institutions through the system that we entrust and as local or whatever. And yes, we thought about where the money's going to go, but unless it's that kind of thing, it's not Visa, MasterCard transactions, unless it's not people hearing about it on Facebook. Well, maybe they will have to hear about it on Facebook, but we can't do anything about that. But unless it's that kind of thing, I can't see how we're going to do anything. And that is exactly why I agree with you, Mike. It's about infrastructure around change, in my opinion.
I'm not even going to attempt to round all that out. I mean, there's so many angles and tangents to this. I mean, there's the systemic complexity we're up to, and then there's the enormous diversity between us in terms of the work that we're doing, the kind of orientation we have to it. One of the things I'm aware of at this point is how this issue of organising is coming back, which is great. We've got onto political economy now, which is fantastic. We need to be, it's got to be a revolution. It can't be the current political economy, and that's why I had commons at the centre of my diagram. The commons is absolutely against the state. It's against the market. It's against consumerist individualism. It's a tremendous politics is coming in. The actual political economy is enormously powerful. And if we just act as consumers, the financial institutions track all of our transactions. Or if we just engage in the social media because it works and our swarm can do that. And meanwhile, Facebook is developing profiles of all of us. Then it's not going to change the world. It's meet the new boss, same as the old boss. How do we get out of that? It's not easy. We won't do it today.